Alrighty, in this video I kind of want to go over some of the basics when it comes down to actually rigging something like a firearm, or really this kind of applies to any hard surface. And the way I want to talk about, or the way I want to go about this is kind of show you how to make your own custom shapes, such as this cylinder or this torus that I've turned into kind of like a weird looking ball, looks like a dog toy, and just about going over and setting those up to where you have decent control over what you're trying to do, and then moving all the normal bones over to different posed layers or different bone layers. So I still have a couple bones I need to do, but you can see here's my trigger bone, and the only thing I can do with it is I can just rotate it around based off the control bone. I still have to do the magazine release, the bolt, charging handle, dust cover, and I believe that is it. So I'll show you the magazine release first, then we'll move on to something a little bit more complicated, such as the bolt and charging handle. Because when I pull the charging handle back, what I want to happen is I want it to pull the bolt back to a certain point, as well as have the bolt be able to move back and forth freely. But when I move the bolt back and then move the charging handle slowly back, I don't want it to engage and pull the bolt back until the charging handle has reached past the point that the bolt has moved back, if that makes any sense. So this has been a little while since I've done this, but let's go ahead and just begin. And first thing we'll talk about is actually doing the shapes. So what I'll do is I'll select my magazine release here. So you can see I have a bone for magazine release. And I also have a bone for, well, I name it CB magazine release. So I'll go ahead and delete that one. So what I have is my magazine release bone. It's set to deform, obviously, because when we go to export this out, I only want deformed bones to export. The control bones don't get exported with it. They're just there to aid in the animation process. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to Shift D to duplicate that bone. And I always name mine CB underscore, then the name of the bone. That way I know that is the control bone that, well, it's the control bone, obviously. Then I uncheck deform. So once that's done, I head back over into pose with it selected and come down here to the bone properties, go under viewport display. You have a custom shape option, and here's where you would set the shape. So I've actually already made the shape here, which is the, let's find it, the magazine release. Here it is, mag release. And that's this guy right here. So that's all this is. Now, I'll make something simple. I'll make just a simple, what do you call it? Just a simple rectangle. So I'm going to Shift A, go to Mesh, and I'm just going to select a cube. Obviously, got to scale this way down. And why is my origin over there? There we go. Scale it way on down. Something about that. Then scale it up on the Y. Control A and scale, apply the scale. Then I want to delete the faces because I don't want a solid object. So I'm going to select everything, press X, and delete only faces. And now I have my boxy rectangle. So what I want to do here is I want to apply that bone, the control bone, so it has a shape of this rectangle that we just made. So I want to go back into pose mode, make sure CB magazine release is selected. For the custom object, I'm going to select our object we just made. Go ahead and scale it on down. Something fairly small, just do 0.0 or 0.1. And then we want to move it and kind of size it so it makes a little bit more sense. So what we can do is go into edit mode on our little rectangle here. And as we make changes, we can see it alters the control bone visually. So we know we want to move it back on the Y. So we want to go that way, and I'll just have it kind of at the tip there of the button, like so. And then it's sticking out good ways that way. So I know I need to select these four and move them forwards on the Y so they're not nearly as long. Let's move this back out a little bit and along those lines, and then we can kind of just scale it down altogether. So what I want to do is I want to bring top down, the bottom up, and then I'll select all and press S, then X to scale it back on the X-axis to make it skinnier. And then I'm just going to scale it down on the Z a little bit farther. So there we have our bone. So this is now our new magazine control bone right there. I obviously don't really care to have this, so I'm just going to change it back to what I had because it, well, it's visually what I wanted. I don't remember what the scale was. Yeah, that was right, 0.03 or 0.3. So now let's say we have our, our control bone set up. We're good to go. Now we want to kind of link these two so it only moves this direction. So when I basically want this motion to be the only motion that it could possibly have. And I also want to limit it as to how far it can go. So with our normal bone selected, let's go down to bone constraints, and we're going to add a, where is it, copy location. Or better yet, because we're going to be applying limits here to this constraint, or to that control bone as well, we're just going to do copy transforms, even though I don't see us rotating anything. So it may be more efficient just to do copy location. We're going to select our armature for the target, and then we're going to select our CB magazine release, like so. And currently I want to change the target to local space and local space. And as you can see, when I move this around, it follows it. So it's kind of linked together. All right. So that's good to go there. However, I only want it to be on one axis. So here you can see we have our y-axis and our x-axis. I only want it to move on the x, so I'm going to untick y and z. And now when I move it around, all right, it's currently moving up on the y. So let's replace x with y. And there we go. So it doesn't matter if I move it along the y-axis. That bone is not going to move unless I move it on the x. So there we go. Now select our control bone, and we're going to add some constraints here. So we want to, first off, limit rotation. I want to tick all three of these and change it to local space and check effect transform. Now, if I leave this unchecked, even though I can't rotate it, you can see all these values up here for the rotation are changing. If I check effect transform and rotate it around, they do not get influenced. So I want to make sure that that is ticked, because again, I do not want this to rotate at all. Now let's select limit location. Again, local space and effect transform. So we want to go in the, I believe it was the X. So let's try that. Yep, so we can only move it in the X. So we want to, or sorry, in this case it's doing the Y. So if I, for example, limit to the Y and move it on the X, I can't do it. So we want to add our limits to the Y-axis. So we like where it's at right now, so on the Y it's 0. Then if I move it over, as you can see, this Y value is increasing. So we want to make and keep an eye on that value. But we want to go as far as we can possibly go on that. So that's going to be our limit. So let's drag it over. And once it's about flush with the cutout, that's about where I want to have it. So let's copy that location value, tick maximum for the Y, paste it in there, and for the minimum, make sure that's at 0. All right, so now we cannot go farther in either direction than that. I cannot rotate it, and I cannot move it in any other direction but the direction that is intended to go. So we know that that is set up and working and good to go, so it's no problem there. Now it's the same thing for locations. So for example, I have this bone here for the fire selector. As I rotate that, I can only rotate it on the one axis. I cannot move it or anything like that. It's the same thing. So if we click on this bone here, we have copy rotation, and we only want to copy it on the x-axis, and we make sure we apply it for just the local space. Now as far as the control bone goes, we limit the location because we don't want to be able to move it. And for the rotation, we pretty much lock it down on every axis except for the X. And I have this set to world space. I want to change that back to local space. And we end up we're good to go with the same result. So let's see. So that's how you kind of handle the rotation. It's the same thing. Nothing special there. So now that we have that, let's move on to our charging handle and bolt. Now this can be the same process. So we add a bone constraint to our control bone, or not our control bone, our deform bone. Let's go ahead and do a copy location. It'll be for the armature. And for our control bone, bolt carrier group, local space, and local space. Now this should be, I think, on the x-axis. So let's check it. All right, that is the wrong one. Try the Y. Oh yeah, so it is the Y. So that one's correct, go figure. So that's all we really want on that one. So now if we click on our control bone to add a bone constraint, we want to kind of add some limits. So same thing again. We don't want to rotate this. So obviously we want to limit the rotation. Check, 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 check. And I always apply local space just for myself. So now I cannot rotate it at all. Can't rotate the control bone at all. And let's go ahead and actually do the same thing for the charging handle just so we can get that moving. So we select the deform bone for the charging handle. We want to copy the location, armature again, and our control bone for the charging handle, and only check Y in the local space. So now as we move it, we are limited in that direction. Okay, so obviously the charging handle, we need to add some limits here. So kind of hard to see where it's at. Yeah, I can kind of see it. So let's see, where is it? There's the end. I want to be able to pull it back. Let's see, so the hook is up there. And that would be probably about a max of, I'd say that would be about as far back as I could pull it. Maybe a little bit less. So about there. So that's my max. So I want to copy that. And I want to add a limit location for the bone constraint. So let's go ahead and do local space, effect transform. And I believe this should be on the X. No, it's actually the Y on this one. Okay, so minimum is going to be 0. Maximum is going to be that value that we just copied up there. So now as I move it, we are stuck between those. I forgot to check the X. So it cannot move beyond that value. So it's constrained to where it's supposed to be. Let's throw that back at 0. And now we kind of have to link up this control bone to this control bone. So as we pull the charging handle back, I want the bolt to come back. So we got to set that up. So we also actually we still want to limit the location on this guy as well, because we don't want it to be able to, well, when we're animating and we want to animate just the bolt, we don't want it to go do that. And same thing, we don't want our control bone to be all over the place. So let's add a limit location really quick. Tick all the same boxes, local space, and for the maximum on the Y, let's paste in that value that we used for the the charging handle. Okay, so we can't, so we're just moving it in the wrong direction. Let's change this to negative. I just realized I got myself backwards there. Change the maximum to 0, change the minimum to that. Wait, where am I getting wrong here? Okay, set you to 0. Okay, so it's a different axis. Why is it a different axis? We're both on local space. Yep. Okay, so is it the X? Nope. Alright, so the maximum on the Y is just going in the opposite. Ah, yes, I see. So the direction for the bones are just oriented, backwards. So we want to be able to go in the opposite direction. So let's check this for maximum for 0 and uncheck it for the other way, for the minimum. So now if we paste in that value as a negative, so this is the same maximum for the charging handle. So this guy right here, we're at that point. So that's going to be our minimum. So we're going to do negative that value. So there we go. And realistically, I only need the bolt to come back to about, or the bolt carrier to come back about where the bolt is just barely visible. So I'm going to make this my max instead. And I'm going to do the same thing for the charging handle, except I'm going to make that a positive. So that's as far as that goes. And that's as far as the charging handle goes. Okay, we have our limit set. Now with our control bone for the bolt, we're going to do a copy location. Again, let's select our armature and select the charging handle for the control bone. Now we want to select local space, and we need to figure out which axis it's going to be on. Okay, so it's on the y-axis. Let's go ahead and invert the y. And as we pull back on the charging handle, the bolt comes back too. Now if I move the charging handle back, as you can see I can't, so we want to check offset. So now I can move the bolt back, or the bolt carrier back. So I'm going to open it halfway, then I'm going to grab the charging handle. As you can see, it moves it back. However, the problem is the bolt's been moved back, well, a good bit farther. So it's not really constrained still, so to speak. So actually, would that be the order? Yeah, so that was the order. That's my bad. So we want to make sure we have the limit of location at the ends. So that's applied. So for example, let's say we limit the location and the rotation, and then I copy the location of, I need to add a limit rotation, or stop the rotation for that. But let's say we add a copy location after we apply the limit for the location. Well, that's going to give us this problem. So I move it all the way back, and then I grab the charging handle and I move that all the way back. Well, the bolt is now back way deep in the buffer tube. So if we apply the copy location first, and then we make sure we limit the location, then if we move the bolt all the way back, they grab the charging handle and move that back, nothing happens, which is really what we want. So now we have a charging handle that works pretty much the same as the actual firearm. So I move the charging handle back, bolt comes back. Move it forward, the bolt's going to kind of slam forwards, which, depending on the magazine release and if there's no rounds in it to follow or catching it, that's going to kind of control whether or not that happens. But that's up to the animator's job there. But same thing, if I move the bolt back, we have free reign of the charging handle, and you just kind of, it gives you a little bit more control over everything. The only thing I have to do left would be, actually no, I made a control bone already. I just haven't set that up. I'm not too worried about it. I'll just do that last. So next up, we want to move these to a separate layer. So I'm going to select all of my deform bones. So pretty much everything that's green, like that. Can't move everything, which is good. Then I'm going to go over here to the running man, so object data properties. And if I press M, we have changed bone layer. So we can move these to whichever layer we want. Now I usually put my control bones, for the firearm anyways, directly beneath my actual bones, or my control bones. So I have on the bottom layer here, my actual control bones. And I just realized I forgot to move the one for that magazine over there. So let me select that guy, move it down, and we're good to go. So here I have my control bones. You know, everything is good to go there. Everything gets nice and controlled just fine. Then if I come back here to this layer, I have my actual bones, which should really be, I need to lock these down a little bit better so nothing like, I can't scale them, for example, but they're on their own layer. So that way, this is pretty much the only thing that the animator is having to work with. Ignore this bone and this bone, or sorry, ignore the two deform bones, but they're left with a much nicer rig that they can kind of work and play with. And obviously you're going to have constraints on them. So I'm going to have another constraint where I cannot rotate that or scale it. So that's where you would go through and you would just do a limit rotation, check, 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 check. I always do local, and now I can't rotate it, but I can still scale it. And you would do it again. Same thing, limit the scale, check, 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 blah, blah, blah. Doesn't matter. This is for myself, so I don't really care. And you would want to run that through on pretty much every bone that would have that problem. So magazines, you want to be able to rotate and move around, so we don't really want any constraints on there. You don't want to scale it, obviously. So you would add a limit scale, tick, 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 and local. And I just realized I did those all at 1, or at 0, so let's limit that to 1, and then I cannot scale it until I go into that negative value, which is one of those things, it almost acts like that has gimbal lock for scale, which is weird. Yeah, because it goes from 1 to -1, even though it's locked at 1. So it's almost acting like it has gimbal lock for scale, which should only be rotation. But anyways, that is really all there is to it. I hope this was this wasn't a direct tutorial, as I didn't want to go through and rig up the entire firearm, mostly because I had already started this one. But this should give you a rough overview on how you can go through and rig up your firearms or other hard surface objects. and set up controls for them to be clean, to where you only have things that you want. And they look at least somewhat decent. So you can obviously tell just off in the distance while looking at it that this bone up here, even though you can't see the mesh itself, is most likely the charging handle based on its shape. I usually limit these or set specific ones for specific things. So I always have 2 magazines. I want to have 2 magazine bones. I want them to be the same. And same deal, I want them to have the same bone group. So that's one last thing I want to cover real quick. Let's say you want to have a specific color for specific bones, like I do here. So let's say I want to have a magazine color for these two. So these would be my magazines. I'm just going to remove it and delete it. So here's my magazine bones. What I can do is I can add a plus sign under bone groups. I want to call it magazines. Go down here to color, and we're going to change our default theme color to, in my case, yellow, and hit assign. However, before you hit assign, make sure you only have your magazine bones and nothing else selected, and press assign. And now you have them, and they are colored up. So yeah, and if you want to go back and you can select both magazines, you can do so. Same thing, if you want to make sure you have all your controls good to go, you can still go through and do so. Which one am I moving? Was it this guy? Oh yeah, I haven't added any constraints to it. So yeah, that pretty much sums up everything that I can think of. Eventually I'll have a full tutorial on this, kind of starting from scratch, where we literally just going to rig up an entire firearm and set it up like this. But for the meantime, I figured this will be a good kind of placeholder. Anyways, that's going to be all for this video. If you like what I'm doing and you want to help support me, you can find a link to my Patreon down in the description below, where I have a team deathmatch series just for patrons, as well as you get early access to pretty much all my videos. And I just realized I need to move this optic back a tad. Yep. And if you have any questions or anything like that, feel free to join my Discord that's also linked down below, and I'll try to help you out. So I'll see you in the next video.